around the head and forced into the mouth, the scold's bridle was an iron instrument of punishment and public humiliation, pressing onto the tongue to silence the wearer and causing excessive salivation and deep fatigue. Lined up before a firing squad in December 1944, this German infiltrator had been convicted by a military court for wearing American uniforms during the Battle of the Bulge, a tactic designed to seize Meuse River bridges before Allied forces could destroy them. Standing on a bridge deep within the Marmolada Glacier in September 1917, this Austro-Hungarian soldier was part of a remarkable hidden world. 12 kilometers of tunnels, housing barracks, chapels, and kitchens, carved entirely by hand from the ice below. In September 1918, with the men of a nation fighting overseas, young women stepped quietly into the work left behind, delivering ice through city streets in wagons and carts, keeping households running in an age long before refrigeration reached ordinary homes. Photographed by Ernst Haas in Vienna in 1947, this returning prisoner disembarked among crowds searching desperately for lost faces, a scene so quietly devastating that Haas abandoned his fashion assignment and documented what would become his celebrated essay, Homecoming. Photographed in 1907, Maud Wagner, acrobat, contortionist, and circus performer, born in Kansas in 1877, became the first known female tattoo artist in the United States, carrying her craft through the traveling circus world of the early 20th century. Known to history as Lawrence of Arabia, Colonel Thomas Edward Lawrence served as a British Army officer, archaeologist, and diplomat whose actions during the Arab Revolt and the Sinai and Palestine campaign shaped the final years of the First World War. Arrested in November 1938 at just 23 years old, a young Frank Sinatra faced charges of seduction and adultery, leaving behind a mugshot that offered little hint of the extraordinary musical career waiting quietly ahead of him. Gripping a Tommy gun along England's coastal defenses near Hartlepool in 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill inspected the fortifications built against a German invasion, his presence along the shoreline a visible statement of national resolve in the war's darkest early years. Standing in a muddy First World War dugout, this German soldier wears a brow plate slid down around his neck, an attachment designed to shield against grenade shrapnel, a small, telling detail of how soldiers adapted to survive the relentless violence of the trenches. Gathered in Brussels in 1927 for the 5th Solvay Conference on Quantum Mechanics, 29 of the world's greatest scientific minds posed for a photograph that would become legendary, 17 of them either already holding or destined to receive the Nobel Prize. Photographed together on Cape Cod on the 4th of July 1953, the newly engaged John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier shared a moment of quiet happiness that could not yet know how completely their lives were about to belong to history. Standing beside his car on a street emptied by financial ruin, this man offered his automobile for sale after losing everything in the Wall Street crash of 1929, one quiet human face within a catastrophe that wiped out fortunes across 2 devastating October days. Standing alone in dense fog at an empty ground in 1937, goalkeeper Sam Bartram continued to guard his posts long after the match had been abandoned, unaware until a bewildered policeman emerged from the mist to tell him the field had been deserted for 15 minutes. Photographed later in life, Alan Turing, mathematician, logician, and the father of artificial intelligence, had broken wartime codes, conceived the modern computer, and reshaped human knowledge yet died without full recognition in Britain, his contributions long obscured by secrecy and the cruelty of his time. On the 7th of July, 1912, Harry Houdini stepped calmly into a wooden crate on the edge of New York Harbor, preparing for an underwater escape stunt that captured the breathless attention of a city already accustomed to his defiance of the impossible. Standing beside the Schwerer Gustav in 1943, Adolf Hitler gazed upon one of the largest artillery pieces ever built, a railway gun weighing nearly 1,300 tons, capable of hurling 7-ton shells across 47 kilometers of open terrain. 14 years old and convicted in a proceeding later vacated as deeply unfair, George Stinney became the youngest American executed in the 20th century, put to death by electric chair in South Carolina in June 1944, a case that would haunt the conscience of history. Arriving aboard the SS Normandy in New York City in 1936, Salvador Dalí, the Spanish surrealist whose precise draftsmanship and haunting imagery had already made him one of the most distinctive artists of his generation, stepped onto the dock and into a city ready to receive him. 3 young boys paused together for a photograph in Jamaica, their easy closeness capturing something simple and unguarded that the camera, in that quiet moment, was fortunate enough to find. Standing beside the signpost at Bodo Airport in Norway, a little girl looks out at a world still full of distances she has yet to travel, frozen there in 1968 by a Scandinavian Airlines photographer. Every single minute since midnight on July 2, 1937, a soldier has stood watch over the tomb of the unknown. A vigil so unbroken it has quietly become one of the most enduring acts of human devotion in modern memory. Inside the tomb of Pharaoh Ramses XI, archaeologists pause from their extraordinary work to share a simple lunch together in 1923, the ancient walls surrounding them as naturally as any ordinary room might. In 1975, Gerald Ford drops to the floor of the White House for push-ups, offering a rare and quietly humanizing glimpse of an American president in a moment entirely his own. At the 1908 London Olympics, a gold medal was claimed, one of the earliest chapters in a modern sporting tradition that would grow over the following century into a global spectacle watched by billions. Pulled from a soldier's pocket after surviving the First World War, these coins stopped a bullet meant for their owner, becoming small, unremarkable objects that carried the full, staggering weight of a life preserved. Towering above the rooftops of Paris in 1886, the Statue of Liberty stands fully assembled for the last time on French soil, before being carefully taken apart and shipped across the Atlantic to her permanent home in New York. During the trial of the century, defense attorney Johnny Cochran built his case around a pair of gloves that appeared not to fit O.J. Simpson's hands, delivering the now famous line that would shape the jury's decision and divide public opinion for decades. On June 20, 1993, Michael Jordan led the Chicago Bulls to their 3rd consecutive championship, becoming only the 2nd player in history to be named Finals MVP 3 times, cementing a legacy that had already begun to feel historic. In 1991, Princess Diana extended her ungloved hand to an AIDS patient, a single quiet gesture that challenged widespread fear and stigma, and reminded a watching world that human dignity required no protective barrier between people. In 1980, the United States men's hockey team defeated the Soviet Union at the Winter Olympics, a victory so unexpected amid Cold War tensions that it would later be remembered simply as the miracle on ice. 3 weeks after the troubled Let It Be sessions. The Beatles returned to the studio in 1969 to record Abbey Road, their final album together. Photographed here preparing to cross the road that would give that last shared work its name. At the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists from the medal's podium during the national anthem, a silent, powerful protest against racial discrimination that would echo far beyond the stadium and long past that single afternoon. On July 8, 1942, women gather in Port Washington, New York, to paint propaganda posters, their brushes moving steadily through a moment when the work of the home front was as deliberate and purposeful as anything happening overseas. Amid the rubble of her bombed London home in 1940, a young girl sits quietly with her doll, the two of them together in the wreckage, carrying within a single image the full human cost of a city at war. Inside a London music store in 1955, customers browse and listen, caught in an ordinary afternoon that belonged to a decade when music was quietly becoming something far more central to daily life than anyone yet quite understood. In 1958, Audrey Hepburn moves through her shopping with a fawn at her side, an image so gently unusual that it seems less like a photograph and more like a moment borrowed from one of her own films. High above the East River in 1914, painters work along the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge, their figures small against the structure they are maintaining, doing ordinary labor at an extraordinary height with apparent and unhurried calm. Separated even in death by the religious divide that had defined their lives, a Catholic woman and her Protestant husband lie in adjoining graves in the Netherlands in 1888, a low wall between them that speaks quietly to a world neither could entirely escape. In 1967, Catherine Switzer's hood slipped back mid-race to reveal that a woman was running the Boston Marathon as an official entrant, prompting organizers to attempt to remove her from the course as she pressed forward to become the first woman to finish it. In 1965, an unknown American soldier stands somewhere in Vietnam, his face and name lost to time. One figure among thousands caught inside a conflict whose full meaning the world was, still in those early years, struggling to understand. Long before fame found him, a young Will Ferrell poses for his 1984 prom photograph, looking much like any other teenager of that decade, unaware, as most are at that age, of the life still entirely ahead of him. Captured around 1956 at a British institution for mental deficiency. This image holds within it a quiet and difficult history of how society once treated those it did not fully understand, a chapter that would later be examined with far greater scrutiny. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton sits with her hand raised to her mouth as President Barack Obama and his national security team wait in real time to learn whether the operation he had ordered against Osama bin Laden had succeeded. Muhammad Ali stands over a fallen Sonny Liston in 1965, a photograph so arresting in its composition and energy that it has long since become one of the most recognizable images in the entire history of sport. A black police officer stands in Austin, Texas, shielding a Ku Klux Klan member from the surrounding crowd at a rally, an image that holds within a single frame the full, unresolved complexity of duty, law, and conscience. Scattered across the Pacific like a vast and terrible constellation, the mapped locations of every sunken Japanese warship from the Second World War together form a document of destruction that no single battle report could ever fully convey. small enough to feel almost playful yet serious enough to have earned its place in automotive history. The Isetta emerged in the 1950s as the world's first microcar, a compact bubble of ingenuity born from a post-war world still learning to move again. On January 21, 1986, the entire British Concorde fleet stands gathered at London Heathrow, a rare portrait of those elegant machines together on the ground, each one carrying within it the particular ambition of an age that believed speed itself was progress. Painted onto the wall of a Pompeii home sometime in the 1st century AD, the portrait of Baker Terentius Neo and his wife looks back across 2,000 years with a directness that makes the distance between their world and ours feel, for a moment, surprisingly small. Rising 60 feet above Julian-Josses, France, Armand Pierre Fernandez's long-term parking holds 60 cars suspended forever within 18,000 kilograms of concrete, a monument completed in 1982 that asks, without quite answering, what we choose to preserve and what we allow to harden into permanence. At the Faculty of Medicine in Kabul in 1962, 2 Afghan medical students lean in to examine a plaster cast alongside their professor, an image from a decade when everyday life in Afghanistan carried within it a quieter, less documented story than the one the world would later come to know. Inside the original Heinz factory in Pittsburgh, around 1897, a female worker moves through the careful rhythm of bottling ketchup, her labor one small part of an industrial operation that was already, by the close of that century, feeding a nation one bottle at a time. Suspended 230 feet above the gorge of Capilano Canyon in Vancouver, the bridge photographed here in 1905 stretched 450 feet across the first canyon, offering those who dared to cross it a passage that tested nerve as much as it rewarded the view on the other side. At the 1936 New South Wales Police Carnival, competitors race motorcycles strapped to the front of chariots, reviving an ancient sport with modern machinery in a spectacle that managed to be both genuinely dangerous and entirely irresistibly watchable. Captured on April 3, 1945, by soldiers of the U.S. Ninth Army, 16-year-old Hans-Georg Henke sits in the hours after his capture, his youth written plainly across his face, a reminder that the final months of the Second World War were fought, on all sides, at a terrible human cost. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb known as Little Boy rests in its pit on Tinian Island in the Marianas, waiting to be loaded onto the Enola Gay for a mission whose consequences would reshape the remainder of the 20th century. Marketed in the 1980s as the ultimate small business computer, this machine arrived at a moment when personal computing was still new enough to carry genuine excitement, before the technology became so familiar that the wonder of it became difficult to remember. In Hamburg in 1946, a figure moves through the wreckage of post-war Germany searching for food, one human form inside a landscape of aftermath that captures, without commentary, what it looked like when a war was over, but its hunger had not yet ended. Built nearly 2,000 years ago on the orders of Emperor Caligula, the ships were discovered in 1929 and revealed to be floating palaces of marble, mosaic, plumbing, and technology far ahead of their time, only to be destroyed by fire in 1944 before the world had finished learning what they contained. Shot more than a century ago and rendered in sharp, colorized detail, this photograph of men unloading a banana boat in New York collapses the distance of time, just enough to make the weight of their labor and the texture of the dock feel immediate and present. Gathered around brightly colored products in the 1950s, the women at this Tupperware party are participants in a domestic social ritual that was, beneath its cheerful surface, quietly reshaping how American households organized, stored, and thought about the objects of everyday life. Mounted on a stand at Balling Field in 1921, this aircraft detection device captured sound from the sky in the years before radar existed, a strange and earnest piece of technology that represents humanity's early and imperfect effort to hear what was coming before it arrived. Photographed in 1852 at the age of 103, Conrad Heyer was born in 1749, making him one of the earliest born individuals ever to have sat before a camera, a living connection between the age of revolutions and the emerging age of recorded images. Carved entirely from a single sapphire, the blue stone at the center of this ring once belonged to Emperor Caligula, a small and luminous object that has traveled from the height of Roman imperial power to the quiet distance of a museum display case. Caught mid-stride and moving in the opposite direction from their famous album cover crossing, the Beatles walk back along Abbey Road in 1969, a candid counterpoint to the image that would soon become one of the most imitated photographs in the history of popular music. Photographed in Oregon in August of 1939, an unemployed lumber worker and his wife make their way to the bean harvest. The Social Security number tattooed on his arm, a small and striking detail that speaks to the particular desperation of lives navigated during the Great Depression. While the world rushed to the hospital on the day Albert Einstein died in 1955, photographer Ralph Marmorse went instead to the office, where he was quietly permitted to photograph the desk exactly as Einstein had left it, capturing an absence more eloquent than any crowd could have produced. Elegant in its density and humbling in its scope, the Standard Model Lagrangian compresses everything humanity currently understands about the fundamental particles and forces of the universe into a single equation that fits, improbably, on a single line. Stretched beneath the Golden Gate Bridge during its construction, the safety net installed at the insistence of the chief engineer ultimately saved 19 lives. A practical act of foresight woven into the structure of what would become, at its opening in 1937, the longest and tallest suspension bridge in the world. In September of 1940, mountaineers work alongside a mule to haul a car free from a creek, a scene of practical rural problem-solving that sits comfortably at the unhurried intersection of old technology and stubborn necessity. Inside a dormitory room at the University of Illinois in 1910, students have arranged their small personal space with the same instinct toward comfort and self-expression that would mark student rooms across every decade that followed. The details different, but the impulse entirely familiar. In 1964, architect Minoru Yamasaki poses alongside a model of the World Trade Center he designed, a moment of professional pride captured before the towers were built, before they became iconic, and long before the world came to know them through their absence. Workers tend to the ancient stones of Stonehenge during restoration efforts in the 1950s, continuing a careful stewardship of the site that had begun in 1880, when William Flinders Petrie first surveyed the monument and established the numbering system for its stones still used today. During a visit to Carlsberg's brewery in Copenhagen in 1962, Yuri Gagarin pauses to pour himself a beer, offering a quietly human portrait of the man who had, just the year before, become the first person ever to travel into space. lining the street in 1936 to witness King George V's coffin pass by. Onlookers hold up mirrors to see over the crowd, a gesture that seems, across the decades, to anticipate something about the way a later generation would raise their phones to document a world going by. Folded into an airplane seat in the 1980s, Andre the Giant fills the frame with the particular and impossible scale of a man for whom ordinary spaces were never designed, the image at once funny and gently melancholy in what it quietly reveals. Unveiled in 1980, the Citroën Carin concept car rises from its base in a pyramid form that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to a Paris motor show, a vision of the future that was bold enough to be photographed and practical enough never to be built. Seen from an angle rarely chosen, the Great Pyramids of Giza stand less than a kilometer from the edge of the modern city, a proximity that reframes one of the most ancient monuments on Earth as something not isolated in endless desert but pressed quietly against the sprawl of contemporary life. Recovered from the royal tomb in the city of Ur in southern Iraq, this golden war helmet belonging to Sumerian king Mis-Kalamduk has survived 46 centuries since it was made around 2600 BC. Its craftsmanship still precise enough to make the distance of that time feel almost impossible to accept. In a photograph published in Life magazine in 1946, 6-year-old Werfel stands at the Am Himmel orphanage in Austria, looking down at the new shoes on his feet, a small gift from the Junior Red Cross in America, arriving at a moment when small gifts carried a meaning that was anything but small. Built in 1973 and powered by a 16-cylinder locomotive engine, the Terex 33-19 Titan held its place as the world's largest rock truck for 25 years, its gross weight of over 1 million pounds placing it in a category of machine that seems to belong to a different scale of physical reality altogether. Photographed by Russell Lee at the Mays Avenue camp in Oklahoma City during the Great Depression. A man rests in a bed fitted with a roof overhead, the modest shelter above him a measure of both human ingenuity and the particular vulnerability of a life with nowhere else to go. Photographed from the same vantage point one day before, and 4 months after its eruption on May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens reveals in this pairing what it means for a landscape to be transformed completely, the upper 1,300 feet of its summit gone, and a horseshoe-shaped crater left in the silence that followed. Photographed in 1864 by Julia Margaret Cameron, English, actress Ellen Terry looks out from an image so sharp and so composed in its feeling that it requires a conscious effort to remember it was made 160 years ago, long before the career that would carry her name into the next century had properly begun. When Marlon Brando declined his Oscar for The Godfather in 1973, he sent Sacheen Littlefeather to the stage in his place to protest Hollywood's portrayal of Native Americans, a public act of refusal that turned one of the most watched moments in entertainment into something the industry had not prepared itself to receive. Designed for military reconnaissance in the years before aircraft made them obsolete, the man-lifting kite photographed here in 1918 carried its human passenger into the air on the strength of wind alone, a fragile and determined bridge between the ancient dream of flight and its eventual mechanical reality. Standing beside his induction motors in 1898, Nikola Tesla poses with the machines whose design bore his name and whose principles had already begun quietly reshaping the way the modern world would eventually move and be powered. At the 1934 Radiological Exhibition in Westminster's Central Hall, A radiologist operates an X-ray apparatus, the image capturing a moment in medical history, when powerful new technologies were still new enough to be displayed publicly, and their long-term effects on the bodies working with them were not yet fully understood.